Yo, it's Luke, the Metroidvania Guru. If you've been following my channel, firstly, thanks. Secondly, you're probably familiar with my ongoing Metroidvania Tier List series, where I rank every Metroidvania I've ever played. It's not finished, and it probably won't be for a very long time, but that's okay. It's all about the journey, not the destination. During this series, I've gotten a lot of constructive feedback, mainly from people disagreeing with my game placement. But I think the most important piece of criticism I've gotten is the question, how do you even evaluate Metroidvanias? That's a fair question. So, for transparency and to help alleviate any confusion, I wanted to make a video that explains my assessment method, among other things. For instance, what do those letters mean on the tier list? What metrics do you measure in a Metroidvania? And, most importantly, what makes a Metroidvania S-Tier? And when you know it, that's what this video is going to do. But before I get into all that, I gotta lay down the foundation and define exactly what a Metroidvania is.
What is a Metroidvania?
The official definition of a Metroidvania, as stated by Wikipedia, is as follows. Metroidvania is a subgenre of action-adventure games and/or platformers focused on guided nonlinearity and utility-gated exploration and progression. I like this definition, but it's a little dense for me and doesn't have any pictures, so I created this. For a game to be a Metroidvania, it must have these four essential tenets, or columns. It must be a platformer, it must have an interconnected world, it must have utility-gated exploration, and it must have some degree of nonlinearity. If any one of these pillars is missing, the whole construct falls apart, and you won't have a Metroidvania. This brings us to our next point.
What do those letters even mean?
To simplify it, those letters represent the strength of a Metroidvania's columns. The stronger those tenets are, the stronger the columns. Columns come in three strengths: exceptional, average, and weak. An exceptional column means the game hit that tenet with high quality. An average column means the game hit that tenet with expected quality for the genre, and a weak column means the game hit that tenet with subpar quality. A game's columns' combined strength determines that game's ranking on the tier list. Here's a breakdown of the column's strengths needed for each tier. I'll throw it up on the screen for easy reference, and I'll read it out for those just listening. All four columns must be exceptional for an S-tier Metroidvania. A tier must have 2 or 3 exceptional columns and no weak columns. B tier must have 1 or 2 exceptional columns with no more than 1 weak column. C tier can have 1 or no exceptional columns and no more than 2 weak columns. D tier has no exceptional columns and can have 2 or more weak columns. And F tier's columns are all weak, or it could be missing a column entirely. You may notice there's an overlap between tiers. For example, B tier can have 1 or 2 exceptional columns, while C tier can have 1 exceptional column. So if a game has only 1 exceptional column, which tier does the game go to? B or C. Basically, this determination would go down to how many average or weak columns are present. And so another question has been brought to the forefront. How do you determine if a column is exceptional, average, or weak? And to that, my answer is qualitative metrics.
The metrics.
If you follow my channel, you might already be familiar with my metrics. They're the section titles in my Metroidvania analyses videos: combat, abilities and platforming, progression, exploration, and atmosphere and narrative. These are the elements that make up great Metroidvanias and thus represent the concrete that makes each column. And though each of these elements weave in and out of each column or tenet, some elements are more closely tied to specific columns. I'll throw this breakdown up on the screen now. This breakdown is for your standard analysis, but it doesn't encompass everything that could go into each column. For example, for the platformer column, I always focus on combat and abilities and platforming. But I could also consider progression and exploration for this column if the title warrants it. For simplicity's sake in this video, I'll only focus on the standard attributes I measure for each column. As stated earlier, for the platformer column, I look at combat and abilities and platforming. For interconnected world, I look at progression, exploration, and atmosphere and narrative. For utility-gated exploration, I look at abilities and platforming and exploration. And for nonlinearity, I look at progression, exploration, and atmosphere and narrative. Now that we know what elements I measure in each column, we can break them down to better understand how each element is measured.
The metrics breakdown. Combat.
Combat's kind of a big deal in Metroidvanias. Not always, as we've seen in some titles, but typically, yeah, combat's pretty darn important because, more often than not, it's the primary means of engaging with the game's world. Here are the questions I ask when assessing combat. How are the general controls? If button setup is weird or momentum is off, that's going to negatively affect a game's ranking. Is combat fun? Subjective, but meaningful. If I'm not having fun, what's the point? Is there a low skill entry, but a high skill ceiling? Easy to pick up, Hard-to-master combat makes for much more engaging experiences. Are there any unique mechanics? MVs are a dime a dozen, so it helps if an MV does something to stand out. Is the challenge appropriate or fair? Is the game hard by design or hard from lack of design? Are boss encounters engaging? Are bosses legit challenges that push players, or are they just beefed up regular enemies?
Abilities, platforming.
Navigating an MV's world is also pretty dang important, especially if you're expected to be doing some backtracking. Here are the questions I ask when assessing abilities and platforming. How are the general controls? I'm more focused on feel here. Does the momentum feel nice? Does the character feel responsive? Is platforming an integral part of the game? Is the platforming challenging, memorable, fun, or is it glossed over and never evolves? How unique are the abilities? Again, we're tripping over MVs nowadays. The more unique the abilities, the better. Does the world get recontextualized with each added ability? What I'm really asking here is, does engaging with the world change or improve in significant ways due to upgrades?
Progression.
In this section, I mainly focus on the light RPG elements that are prevalent in the Vania side of Metroidvanias. If an MV is closer to the Metroid side of things, they may lack some of these sections' criteria, such as having a leveling system or means of player expression. If that's the case, I adjust scoring to accommodate the title, meaning I don't dock points when an MV doesn't have these things. Here are the questions I ask when assessing progression. Is there a leveling system? What's leveling look like? Is leveling impactful? How does it affect gameplay? What's player expression look like? Are there stats and character builds, skill trees, an accessory system, gear and weapons? What systems are in place for player enhancement? Is there crafting, vendors, side quests? Does the progression's pacing make for a balanced experience? Is progression natural, or is farming and grinding a component? Does the game's challenge scale accordingly with player progression?
Exploration.
Exploration is the most important factor when measuring a Metroidvania. I have to want to explore your world, and I have to be rewarded for that exploration. Here are the questions I ask when assessing exploration. How rewarding is exploration? Are there collectibles, hidden aspects, fascinating locales? Do I feel like I'm compensated for extracurricular exploration? How are the game's secrets and hidden elements? How's the in-game map? Does it exist? How does it fill out? Is it detailed? Does it have any helpful functions? How are the biomes? Are the biomes interesting, unique, diverse? Is there an appropriate amount for the game's length? How's map interconnectivity? At what degree is the world interconnected? Completely? Or is there a stage select screen? Does the world connect in ways that feel natural? How's backtracking? Is backtracking necessary for the critical path? Is there fast travel? Is optional backtracking rewarded? And are those rewards worth it? Is there an X factor? Does the game do something unique to make its exploration stand out in some way?
Atmosphere, narrative.
Atmosphere and narrative, while not the most important aspect of a Metroidvania, can make or break an MV's chances of hitting the S tier. Here are the questions I ask when assessing atmosphere and narrative. How's the game's presentation, music, graphics, art style, character and enemy designs, and of course, performance? Do the elements in its presentation work together to create an engaging experience? Do the elements mesh to make a cohesive and appropriate tone? Do I get immersed in the game's world? How's the plot? Is it interesting, unique, complete, comprehensive? How's the narrative's delivery? Are we looking at a standard story, or are we picking up bits and pieces from item descriptions and whatnot? How's the environmental storytelling? What other methods are being used? And are these methods effective? Are there multiple endings or a true ending? Pretty self-explanatory. The only thing to add is, if there are multiple endings, how are these endings achieved? Through player choice or by some other means? Are these alternative paths logical, and do they add to the narrative or world building? Okay. Now that we know what all the metrics are and what they mean, let's see them in action.
What makes an S-Tier Metroidvania?
The best way to illustrate what makes an S-Tier Metroidvania is to dissect an S-Tier Metroidvania. For this exercise, I'm going to use a relatively newer kid on the Metroidvania block, 9 Souls. First, we look at the 4 columns to ensure we are, in fact, dealing with a Metroidvania. 9 Souls is definitely a platformer, it has an interconnected world, it has utility-gated exploration, and it has elements of non-linearity. So, yep, it's a Metroidvania. Next, we have to determine each column's strength. Exceptional, average, or weak. For this exercise, I'll only be going over the platformer column because I'm certain it'll be enough for you to get the gist of the entire process. So, the platformer column. I take a look at the elements that contribute to this column. Then I go through each of my questions. For time and simplicity's sake, I'm going to be general and vague with my responses here. Let's look at the combat questions. How are the general controls for 9 Souls? Phenomenal. Is combat fun? Probably the most fun combat in any MV. Is there a low skill entry but a high skill ceiling? You betcha. Are there any unique mechanics? The synergy between parrying and the chi mechanic is excellent. Is the challenge appropriate or fair? Very much yes. Are boss encounters engaging? Probably some of the best I've experienced in the genre. Next, ability and platforming questions. How are the general controls? Still phenomenal. Is platforming an integral part of the game? Can confirm. How unique are the abilities? Ability upgrades are not the most unique, admittedly. Does the world get recontextualized with each added ability? Yes, the world opens up and combat gets expanded. So, based on the answers to my questions, how would I grade the platformer column's strength? Considering most questions were answered overwhelmingly positively, it's fair to say this column is exceptional. I would then do the same process with the remaining 3 columns. In 9 Souls' case, the other 3 columns would also get exceptional strength grades. With all 4 columns' strengths being exceptional, it's clear to see that 9 Souls is an S-Tier Metroidvania.
Conclusion.
And there we have it. Now you know how I rank Metroidvanias in the Definitive Metroidvania Tier List. I hope you found this explanation of my process enlightening, and I really hope it clears up more confusion than it causes. I'd love to hear your thoughts on my process. Is it easy to follow? Too convoluted? Is it effective or just plain bad? Let me know in the comments, or just hit the like button, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of my tier list updates. I release one every month. So until then, adios.